This is month 9 of our First Thursday Mystery, and we're going to be paper piecing 2 buildings this month. So in your kit, you do not have a page that tells you what fabrics are included. You got that page 2 months ago when we did our first paper piecing. But for the barn, the background is the polka dot light blue. The barn is the red. The roof is the black. And then the doors are the brown. It mentions filler strips. The filler strips will be coming from the big background piece that you have. Then for the house, I switched the colors up some. There was an awful lot of red in it, and while my youngest would say there's never too much red, I would disagree. So for our windows, rather than red gingham, you have a cream piece that kind of has crosshatch type marks. You have gold for the house. The roof is the red, then the chimneys are the brown with little squares on it, and the background is the light blue swirl. I do want to just go over the patterns real quick, just because this is a mystery, so you guys don't have the picture that I do, so it might not be clear where which colors go. This is a 3-part pattern on both buildings this time, which I'll get into later. But section A on the barn, number 1 is brown, number 2, 3, and 4 are all red. Section B, number 1 is black, and number 2 and 3 are both blue. On section C, number 1 is brown, number 2, 3, and 4 are red, number 5 is black, then 6, 7, 8, and 9 are the blue. On the house, on section A, number 1 is gold, number 2 and 3 are the cream for the windows, number 4, 5, 6, and 7 are gold. On section B, number 1 is red, numbers 2 and 3 are blue, and then on section C, number 1 is blue, numbers 2 and 3 are brown, and numbers 4 and 5 are blue. I'm not going to cut this time. You've seen me cut strips enough that I think you will get it. But before you start cutting up your blue pieces for the foundation piecing, I would recommend cutting your filler strips first. Now, if you have troubles getting your pieces to come out exactly right, you might want to cut your filler strips a little bit wider, and then you can adjust at the end. I'm not telling you how you can adjust at the end, but you could adjust at the end. But from the blue polka dot, we need 1 strip that's 2.5 by 6.5. So I cut it off the short side. I just cut a 2.5-inch strip off, and then cut it down to 6.5, and then the piece that was left I could use in my foundation piecing. And then your other filler strip is a 2 by 9-inch strip. Again, I cut it this way. And again, I cut it down to 9 because I could use that little piece that was left for the foundation piecing. For the house, you need a 4.5 by 3-inch strip. So I cut that off, again, the short way, and then I could use the rest of it for my foundation piecing. There was plenty on both of those. Now, if you're worried that your seam allowances are taking up too much, on this one you could cut it 1/4 to 1/2 of an inch wider, so you could cut a 3-inch strip if you wanted to, and then a 2.5-inch strip, and on this one you could cut like a 3.5-inch strip. That's just some options if you're having trouble getting your pieces to be the right size. We are paper piecing again this month, and if you like the method I showed you 2 months ago, then by all means use that one. The only difference this time, if you're using that method, is that there are 3 sections in each block. So you will paper piece each section and then put those sections together, which I will show you. Today though, just so I can show you something different, I'm actually doing my foundation piecing with freezer paper. Now, freezer paper is available in 8.5 by 11 sheets, and the store does carry it. That is what I usually use, but I have put mine away in such a safe place that I can't find it. So the other option is to cut your 8.5 by 11 sheets from a roll of freezer paper. My personal preference is the pre-cut sheets because they're flatter and are less likely to jam in my printer. But I did cut my 8.5 by 11 sheets from a roll this time, and they like to curl, so roll them the opposite direction before you put them in your printer. When you put them in your printer, the shiny side, or your copier, the shiny side should be up. but the dull side should be down. Now when I'm using freezer paper for my foundations, I like to actually cut my pieces out and cut the outside seam allowances off, especially when I'm putting them together to make a bigger unit, and I'll show you why eventually. This is section A of the barn. My first piece, 1A, is the door. And I'm going to just check and see how big that is, and it's about 2 1/4 by 2. So to oversize, I'm just going to cut a 3-inch square out of my door fabric, and that is this really fine stripe. Just make sure you have enough left for the other. And then my number 2 piece up here is red for the barn, but my biggest pieces for the barn are number 3 and 4. So I'm going to check those first. And those are about 1 7/8 by 2 1/2. So I'm going to cut a piece that's about 2 1/2 inches wide off of my barn fabric. Let's get that out of the way so I don't. How wide did I say? 2 1/2-ish. You could go 2 5/8, 2 3/4 if you want to be really safe. I'm just going to cut that piece off and set it aside because those are my biggest pieces. Looks like I need a new blade. And then for this piece over the door, it's about 1/2 inch by 2 1/4. So if I cut a piece that's, let's just do 1 1/4 off of my red, just a strip, because I can use it up on the top part of the barn too. Okay. So I have my pre-cut pieces. I am using my 1/4 ruler again this time, and I am going to go pre-fold on all the lines. So I'm using the 1/4 plus. If you remember from 2 months ago, if you don't have the 1/4 plus, you could use an index card or a piece of junk mail. Okay, so I pre-folded all my lines. Now I'm ready to get started. So my door is number 1, and you can decide whether you want your stripes going horizontally or vertically. I'm going to put mine horizontally because I know I'm not going to be able to get vertical out of my fabric for the upper one, so I want them to match. So when I go to put this my fabric on here, I want to make sure I have at least 1/4 inch going beyond my cut edge on the pattern, because remember, I cut my seam allowances off the outside edge. So because this is freezer paper, I don't have to glue or pin for piece number 1. I can just iron, and there's nothing special about this iron. I just have lots of tools, so I'm using this one today, but a regular iron will work. So my next piece to put on here is number 2. So I pre-folded this line, but I'm going to put my ruler on there, and this time it is important to have your folds accurate on the lines. I'm going to put my 1/4, the lip over the edge of my fold, and I'm going to cut. And then remember, when we're paper piecing, the first piece always goes down with the right side up. After that, they're all going down with right sides matching the previous piece. So because I trimmed, I can line up this piece with the raw edges, and I know I'll be getting 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I can pin, and I can pin right through the freezer paper with it folded back if I want to, and pin. So I do still have it folded back. This is This is important for this method. At the sewing machine, I do not need to shorten my stitch length for this method because I don't have to tear the paper away. So I set it at my normal stitch length for piecing, and in this case I have it at 2.0. Again, just like last time, I am using a foot that I can see, so I'm using an open toe foot. And I'm going to be sewing right next to the fold of that freezer paper. So needle down is always my friend. And I just need to, and again, I'm starting, you can see where the line is for the next piece. I'm starting a little bit beyond what my stitching line is going to be there. So I will be crossing over that line later. And I just stitch along the fold of the paper. Now if I accidentally catch a stitch in the paper, it's not the end of the world. You can just pop it out. But for the most part, I am not stitching through the paper. So that's my first seam. I'm going to take my piece back to my pressing surface, and you can press it as sewn. You don't want to get your iron on the shiny side of the freezer paper, really. Now I can flip my paper back up, and I'm going to come to this side and flip up the piece that I just sewed on, and I'm going to press it that way, and it will stick to the freezer paper, so it's going to hold it in place. Okay. So now I'm ready to do the trimming for adding my next piece. So we've done 1 and 2, we're ready to do 3. So I'm going to put my beveled edge of my add a quarter plus on the line, and the paper is sticking to the fabric. We can just peel it back off of it in the seam allowance and fold that back. I want to use the beveled edge, not the beveled edge, the lip edge of my add a quarter plus, put it over the fold and trim off the excess. So now I have my 1/4 inch seam allowance. So now I can come back to this side, and that piece that I pre-cut, I'm going to line it up with the raw edges there. Remember, we want to add at least 1/4 inch beyond our cut edges here. I can check it, and it's going to fold beyond the edge of the paper. So let's just fold it back like this, because I don't want to pin into it with a paper flat. I'm going to just pin it in place. Again, if you pin through the freezer paper, that's fine. So that's how it looks on this side. I think I can move it a little better here. There we go. And I'm ready to go sew along this fold. Same thing again, I want to start beyond wherever the edge of that piece is. So this is actually going to be in the seam allowance. So I'm out in the seam allowance. I'm going to stitch right next to that fold of the paper. Pull the pin if it's in my way. And I'm going to sew beyond the edge or the stitching line if that's what it was. And that finishes that seam. So here's my piece. Again, I can flip it over to this side and press the seam. I just want to keep my iron off the shiny side of the freezer paper. Then I want to open my paper back up, flip, and press in place. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and trim this off, because I'm going to use this piece. Doesn't have to be precise. If you wanted to, you could trim it your 1/4 inch. I'm just going to cut it off, leaving a little extra. I'm going to go back over here. Number 4 is the next one that I'm adding. So I'm going to fold back on the number 4 line. I'm going to put the lip edge on the fold of the paper. Cut off my excess, so I have my 1/4 inch seam. Now, something I haven't mentioned is freezer paper can peel up. If it does, all you have to do is line up those lines with your seam lines and press it back on. One of the advantages of using freezer paper, especially if you're doing several blocks of the same thing when you're paper piecing, is you can reuse it. It's not destroyed when you take it off of your piece. So I want that folded back on that line. And again, I'm going to put my raw edge next to the raw edge that I trimmed. And because it's the same size, I already know it's going to extend beyond, but you could check to make it sure it's going to extend. I'm going to pin it in place, and I can pin right through the freezer paper. And I'm ready to sew again. Well, here, there you go. So I've lined it up just like the last time. I'm starting beyond what will be a stitching line in the seam allowance and stitching right next to the fold. And right off the edge, I'm going to flip my piece over, press the seam the way it was sewn. Then I'm going to open my freezer paper back up and press the piece I just added so that it sticks to the freezer paper. If your freezer paper is starting to come up, then press from the freezer paper side. That'll make it stick a little bit better than pressing from the fabric side. Okay, so there's my rough piece. And I can now trim this down. Remember, I cut my seam allowances off. Do not cut right next to the edge of your fabric. You need to add the seam allowances back in. So I'm going to put my 1/4 inch line on that cut edge. Trim, trim, rotate, and finish trimming. And I believe the block, if you look at the paper you got 2 months ago that lists out the fabrics for each block on the paper piece units and the finished sizes, was 6 inches wide. So I want to check to make sure this is going to be 6 inches wide, and I can fudge it a little bit if it isn't. It's pretty close. Cut and cut. So that's my first section, and I'm just going to construct all the sections that same way, and once I have my sections together, I'll come back and show you the rest of the process. I have my 3 sections of the barn all sewn together, and they are all trimmed down, leaving my 1/4 inch seam allowance along the outside edge. Don't forget to do that or you won't be happy. So now we just need to sew these 3 sections together. Now, if everything is perfect and the pattern was drawn perfectly, I should be able to just flip these and sew them. This one I can, there's nothing to match. This one's going to be the tricky one onto here because, and it looks like the pattern may be off a little bit, because I want this, I don't want it hanging over the roof here. So what I can do is I can flip this over and I can put a pin in through where that seam is. And then I can look on this side, and I don't know whether you can see it or not. And I want to make sure it's coming right there in that angle so that it's matching up perfectly. Now, it would really be best to put a second pin in there. And then I'm going to come down on the other end and do the same thing. Make sure that this point is matching up with the angle on this point. And then I can just sew my 1/4 inch seam. So you can either put your 1/4 inch foot on, or you can just sew along the edge of the pattern. Once I've sewn my sections together, then you can choose whichever works best to press one direction or to press the seams open. And now I just want to point out, it looks funny here, like the roof is not meeting the edge of the house, but this is your seam allowance, so it's not wrong. It should have that jut out there like this one and this one. So the last thing to do on these blocks is to add our filler strips. On the house, it goes on top. And on the barn, the wider one goes on top first, and then the narrower one goes on the right side. Here are my finished house and barn blocks. So why would I want to use this method of paper piecing over the one where I sew through the paper? Well, my number one reason is this right here. I can just grab the paper and peel it off, and I don't have all the little bits. But there are a couple others. I can use a longer stitch length, which means that if I make a mistake, it's easier to tear it apart. My foundations are reusable. As you can see, this one is usable again. It wouldn't make any difference on these blocks because I'm only doing one, but if I'm doing something or I'm making multiples, I can reuse this paper maybe 2 or 3 times. And The other thing is, if I want to, I can peel the freezer paper back a little bit and I can choose which direction I want to press my seams. I didn't worry about it on these blocks, but if I wanted my seams to go a certain direction, I can peel the paper back and press them, which I cannot do when I'm sewing through the paper. So a couple cons: if I was doing pieces that had little teeny tiny pieces with really tiny sharp points, I would probably want to sew through the paper because it's probably just a little bit more stable. The other thing is, if you do it the way I did it, you've got to remember to add your seam allowance at the end. And the reason I cut mine off is I'm not sewing through the freezer paper then when I'm putting my sections together. So if it looks interesting to you, give it a try, but you are certainly welcome to just stick with the method I showed 2 months ago where you're sewing through the paper.